It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you today to today's Artist Talk, part of our ongoing art series at the Department of Visual Arts at UC San Diego. I'm Dr. Pınar Yoldaş, an associate professor and head of the speculative design area, and I'm so honored today to host a visionary artist whose work not only reflects the world but actively engages with it, Mary Mattingly. She's an interdisciplinary artist based in New York City, renowned for her innovative approach to environmental and social issues through art. Her practice encompasses sculpture, photography, performance, in large scale public installations, all aimed at exploring themes of sustainability, climate change, and community engagement. Mary's educational journey perhaps laid the foundation for her impactful career. She received her Bachelor of Fine Arts from Pacific Northwest College of Art in Portland and furthered her studies at Parsons School of Design in New York. She was awarded a fellowship at the Yale University School of Art, recognizing her potential and commitment to the arts. Mary's engagement and I would say like work on environment has been on my personal radar for quite some time. So I'm really psyched that really excited that she's here. Her accomplishments are vast and her projects are really complex and multidimensional. So I'm just going to perhaps keep the introduction a little bit short, talking about some more of your exhibitions, and then I'll, let you take us on this journey. Mary's work has been exhibited internationally at institutions such as the Storm King Art Center, Brooklyn Museum, Palais de Tokyo. She's participated in many prominent biennials in Istanbul, Havana. She's received numerous accolades. In 2023, she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. She has grants from Knight Foundation, Harpo Foundation, Jerome Foundation, and she's also been an artist in residence at the Brooklyn Public Library and Rauschenberg Foundation. Her work has been featured in major publications such as New York Times, Art in America, Le Monde, and on Art 21. In 2022, a monograph of her work titled What Happens After was published by the Anchorage Museum and Hirmer. So I want to go on. There are two projects that I personally bring up every quarter. I teach Introduction to Speculative Design. Swale, I'm hoping you're going to talk about that too. So please welcome me and please join me in welcoming Mary. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Yildiz Pinar. Thanks, Joe and Sarah and Paula and Elena and everybody who kind of made this happen today. I'm glad to be here and to be able to be in conversation with everybody during a time of obviously extreme uncertainty, universities, and to be able to talk about what it means to be creative and artists together. And I know that people are really affected by all different types of art, and I've just seen it. So I believe that our work is so important, especially right now. And I'll start there, but I'll probably focus mostly on water and maybe water as a teacher, and go into 3 different projects. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Yeah, so I did want to start maybe by just sharing a more personal story. It's in 2021, imagine. And I was in a basement apartment in Brooklyn that I'm no longer in, thankfully. It flooded and water really surged from the floors and the walls. I think it was the result of a rainstorm meeting the limits of Brooklyn's aging sewer systems. It didn't necessarily, though, it didn't feel like a malfunction. It felt really more like a return, like a reminder that streams were buried under Brooklyn over half a century ago or more, that they hadn't disappeared, that they were still there, sort of moving beneath. the city moving beneath me. And I think that experience became a lens for some of the work that I'll show, really tracing ruptures and imagining repair, or even just like honoring, even if it's temporary or if it's speculative. So at the same time, while I'm struggling to get out of this apartment lease, I was invited to Kalispell, Montana to consider a building there as a site for an installation. And this building had a roof that was also in need of repair. It was leaking water. I knew what to do at that point. I captured the rainwater and the snowmelt on the second floor. And because it was during the height of the pandemic, I think everything really felt like it had stopped. And I was teaching online. I was pretty grateful to be able to actually move to the site and to be working in this building. And the installation did, you know, I didn't really know what it would be at first, but it was able to change and kind of unfold over time. And I was also able to bring a friend of mine there, and we worked with a local potter, and we salt fired vessels that would collect these drips that I'd controlled through landscape tubing that was affixed to the ceiling, kind of letting the water fall into the vessels. And then when the space was finally able to be open to the public a few months later, after this kind of interior destruction of the building and then revamping in a way, people began visiting pretty slowly, but eventually it picked up speed and its meaning changed along the way. People didn't come into the building to watch the drips like I thought. They really came in to sit and listen. They would like close their eyes and stay for longer amounts of time than I could imagine. And so I think I just reinterpreted it as a listening room at that point. And it did keep time, sort of depending on, you know, it went through all 4 seasons, and depending on which season it was and the temperature, the water would really slow to a crawl and turn to ice and become stalactites. And then it would speed up as it warmed up in the room and outside. And it wasn't until later that I guess I also understood this as a kind of a water clock, with its duration really based on weather patterns. And it kept time in a way that I'd say was, at first I considered uneven or random, but then I guess understood that it was also rooted in a deeper, maybe knowledge or deeper way of relating to time. And I wanted to think about it through this lens that philosopher Elizabeth Grosz calls becoming time, where she wants to reorient time as a more emergent, embodied rhythm rather than this fixed metric. So I tried to understand the water clock in that way as it kind of rolled out over this 9-month, 11-month period before the water finally ran dry and then they shut the project down. It was called Limnal Lacrimosa, which means of lake's tears. And at the time, I was also really engaged in the writing of Estrada Namanis, who writes about water as not just an ecological element, but as a carrier of memory and affect and politics. And she proposes this notion of the hydrocommons, which she says is like a fluid meeting of bodies of water and bodies of people. So I wanted to share a quote of Estrada Namanis while listening to the water dripping in this water clock, if I could. So it's a couple of paragraphs long, and it's really been key to how I've been thinking about these as sculptures. This is water clock. And Estrada Namanis says, "There's a glass of water on the table beside you. You pick it up and you take a sip. This water will feed your blood and it will nourish your muscles. It will cradle your organs and serve as vital compass and communicator between your far-flung bodily posts. But it will not remain yours for long. This water will leave you, spreading across your skin when you sweat, rolling down your cheeks when you cry. It will begin its journey to the filtration plant the next time you go to the bathroom. And in all of these leaves, this water will carry its meanings and materiality of you with it." He says, goes on to say, "Which of your emotions will be diverted or damned when this water is converted into hydroelectric power, displacing the caribou in the tree? Which of your senses will dry up as this water is relentlessly extracted from its centuries-old home in an underground aquifer northwest of Toronto? Which of your thoughts will be in poison until 2 to 4 barrels of which water is irredeemably damaged to wash every barrel of human extraction from the with smooth squeezed from the earth, along with this water, so that it may be bottled for those who can't ship. All of this biology, this chemistry, all of this affect, politics, economics, and ethics. All of this is in this glass, which and so started to really think about water there. The water that she's talking about that was at one point across the world millions of years ago in a tsunami is now entering your body and then carrying that memory with it, carrying the memory of you with it to its next location, place, and time. And I'm considering that as I'm thinking about the way that the U.S. Army Corps continues to build caskets for water and try to direct it into a line, and how to respond with the living memory of water that does not want to stay contained in a line. So the idea of the water clock became an umbrella term or system for a system that's like made for water, not really to dominate it, but to respect its rhythm and to respect its inability to be contained. So to make one of these, and I started to make them really consistently since the pandemic, I would start with a really simple drawing and then move to a rendering that I would not necessarily do on my own. This one I didn't. Socrates Sculpture Park did this one. And then from the rendering, when things are more clearly laid out in collaboration with a partner who's hosting a water clock, we would then determine the final system and how robust or willing they are to let it run over and into the space. So this is again from Socrates Sculpture Park. This water clock is called Ebb of a Springtide, and it's in Queens, New York, overlooking the East River, a tidal river, so a salt river. And here the water is moving through the sculpture again at the speed of the river, and here we have it timed, so as the tides rise and fall, the water clock speeds up or slows down, and it's sort of meant to resemble the interior of that building that I had to move out of, that I was lucky to move out of, I should say. It's based on the deconstruction of that, or maybe the translation of that into some sort of informal architectural structure where the water is like the inhabitant and not the threat anymore. So it's running, kind of flowing through bed frames, down ladders that are supposed to suggest stairs, into sinks, through doors, tubs, sort of like a Rube Goldberg machine, I like to say. And then into planters that are growing salt-tolerant foods, which is a strategy that I believe will be more and more necessary in New York. And maybe it's something that's already being done in San Diego. I'd be really curious to know if that's being employed at all. But here, IBC totes are used from the shipping industry. They're oftentimes part of these water clock sculptures. And then another recurring element in a water clock are these stock tanks that I think bring a more agricultural vernacular into a place where it can be less familiar. And since this part of New York City was flooded during Hurricane Sandy, placing the canoe felt like an important sort of symbol or reminder of where the water had been and where it could be. And I think with a installation or sculpture like this, I think one question that keeps recurring for me is, how does memory show up in public space, and how does memory show up in a public space that and maybe like, how does the official memory of a place assert itself, and how can these official memories be sort of expanded to hold more stories? And then it can even move into like, how do people move in and with and through the work? And I think, talking with Sarah yesterday, we were talking through Edward Casey, and I was thinking about place memory and that relationship, and that could also be part of these sculptures. Like, if water indeed holds memory, then an installation like this can maybe trigger memory work. This is another water clock. It's for a memory park. Here, the canoes are supposed to be garden beds, but also maybe more transitional vessels. There are these limestone pouring bowls that are allowing the water to drip down the staircase, and then it's being pumped back up to the top. Maybe a more medical vernacular to reflect on maybe this body of water on life support. Elements from the flood and another sort of water clock in a shelving system. And so, yeah, like I mentioned, I've been doing these more and more, and they're fulfilling something for me personally. And maybe I'm going to sort of officially start the talk here. I broke this talk into 3 different sections: proposals for spheres, proposals for bundles, and proposals for cycles. They're ways that I think I can look at this work and make sense, and how sometimes they seem like completely different projects, but one led into the next. So I wanted to maybe I'll start with spheres and talk about the water pot in more depth within that, and then I'll move into like bundles that are sculptures, and then with cycles I'll talk about Swale. So I'll start by saying, talking about where I grew up. It was on northern most border of Connecticut, near Springfield, Massachusetts, where the drinking water was toxic from chemical runoff from agriculture. And I found this drawing like a few years ago, and I think it probably represents some of what I now consider my first sculptures, which were these tools that I built like when I learned how to clean water. It's just with natural materials and very simple. And then simultaneously, this place, I should say, would also flood every spring. I was making these drawings like these, and I remember my mother taught me how to sew, and a drawing like this points to these early sculptures that I think combine those water purification systems with these, what I called wearable homes. They're these living units that sort of cleaned water, but could also become tents at night or inflate. They were designed to be really practical and functional, but also for a photograph eventually. So the drawing on the right contains like everything from mood regulation to climatological protection to satellite information, or the idea of these things. And then in reality, they sort of resembled these, I guess, billowy, saggy, more sensual bundles. They inflated during floods, and otherwise they would be sort of like storage space. And I imagined that you could float in these. You could really use them in water. And I sort of started to invent this space around them. So older infrastructure was depicted sort of still being there and working. Well-kept infrastructure was usually water for sale. The storms were worse. So anyway, these early sculptures sort of addressed my immediate concerns, and they started to get larger and more absurd. And the scenarios that I was concerned about were, of course, like more and more of the reality. And I think those factors kind of specifically made me react to the work. And a couple of years later, I stopped making photographs about this more individual experience, and started to kind of really think through spheres in a more, I'd say, like communitarian way, maybe first as an enclosure like this or a protective layer, but then as more of a collectivity. And I remember a friend of mine, Scott Patrick Wiener, introduced me to the philosopher or theorist Peter Sloterdijk, who makes this distinction between different types of spheres in his writing. And that really captivated me, that idea. He would say, on the one hand, there are these microspheres that are small scale and intimate spheres, really like the most originary of intimate spaces, the womb or the relationship between lovers. And on the other hand, he would say there are these macrospheres that encompass these larger societal spheres. So I would eventually turn away from depicting that individual situation to focus on the collective space, what that could look like. So this is like many of those wearable homes linked together, I'm sure inspired by artists, architects who were working in this realm. They became a little bit more functional over time. They started to look like living machines with these imagined inputs and outputs or these cycles, these imagined cycles, at least here. And I started to want them to, of course, like be more functional in the way that I wanted the wearable homes to be more functional. And I really became engaged in the way that like a small scale ecosystem could work through people being able to input something, whether it was energy to pump water to the top of a sculpture or like turning something on and watching it work. And I became engaged in this shape and this size because you could tell when something was going wrong and you could sort of pinpoint where it went wrong and why it went wrong and work backwards to see how it could be sort of fixed. And I enjoyed that idea of like trying to think about that as a like in the microspheric context, but then expanding that out into a larger ecosystem and trying to understand like how could this maybe larger project theoretically be quote fixed if it's possible. So this is something that I have been working with, and I'm still very like captivated by the idea of the sphere and the shape. You know, what it means to be able to work within and how porous they are, the smaller scale echoing the larger scale. And I'll show maybe this one more sphere before I go into the water pod. This is in a park in Brooklyn, and it's meant to highlight New York City's drinking watershed that extracts water from upstate New York in a system that I'd say, like what I learned was that most people, including myself, didn't know much about that water system. Most people who live there, but the sphere works with the same logic as the watershed to clean water. So it runs through layers of plants, of earth, and of rock. And I think, you know, I wanted to ask just one really key question with this, which was, how can we as New York City residents understand the people, the flora, the fauna who help protect the drinking watershed as our life partners? Like, how do we know? How do we connect with those we might never see but are completely dependent on? And yeah, how can public sculpture be a form of recognition? So that's all in lead up to the sphere I really wanted to talk about, which is the water pod. And the water pod, this is the first drawing of it. It was to be a spherical living system where somebody could sleep underneath the water, work above. It would be in New York's waterways. It had this sort of island-like infrastructure that would keep it upright, and on top of the island, one would grow their own food and collect water from the top of the sphere with these flexible solar cells that would allow for energy, modicum of energy production. I was really engaged in trying to make this work and happen. And I remember I had this meeting with a public art commissioner in New York City who would take about 15 minutes of her time to engage with artists from around the city and hear about their projects and tell them why they wouldn't work, essentially. So I met with this person and she said, you know, there's a reason why this probably won't work, but if you want to know more, you could talk with the Coast Guard. And I remember thinking it was sort of like a challenge. And I was really like, I couldn't understand why it couldn't work. So I did call the Coast Guard, I think the next day. And the person I talked with, I finally got through to somebody who was frankly probably pretty nervous, but just said, yeah, I mean, maybe we can set up a meeting for the future. We want to see what this is. And so they set up a meeting with me for about 6 months into the future. And during that time, I got a few friends together and we really fleshed out what this project could be. And we went to the Coast Guard, listened to them. They said there's no way that they would let this project happen if it wasn't, made with $10 million or 10 years of engineering experience, at least, which nobody had. But they said there's something that we do like about this, and it's that we have a problem with runoff in the waterways in New York City. So we like the fact that this is self-sufficient. The idea is that there would be no runoff. So maybe if there was a way that you could use a pre-made structure like a barge, which I didn't even really know what they were at the time, we would allow this to happen. So I kind of took that meeting and ran with it and went to the Department of Cultural Affairs and said, you know, the Coast Guard is supporting this as long as we use a barge. And They'll help us with permits and whatever else we need. Now we need to know what permits do we need. And the city then was worried about the fact that this might be in public space. And so everybody started to sort of cautiously work on this idea, but put it off continuously. And I think in my mind, it was like, it could happen if there was no money involved, because we didn't have any money, and we would need to kind of use what we had, find in the waste stream or whatever to make the project work. So all to say that 3 years of partnership building and learning everything about like obscure governmental processes in a very litigious place to plumbing, I was able to present the idea to community boards, to businesses, and to individuals before permissions started to be granted for each potential docking location. But that was really like just the beginning. And I will say that like getting this far was a surprise. The process, the bureaucracy was so intense. It was like 18 permits in the end, a 48-page contract that involved opening a company. All of the paper, like official and unofficial, sort of represented these, at this point, like deep relationships. And I think I kept at it because it felt really absurd. I don't think I thought it was going to happen, but eventually it started to become more and more real. I think, yeah, I think I'm just gonna like go into. I also realize that at times the bureaucratic document can say much more than the photograph, and in this case, it sort of represents that labor and relationship building. But it's also kind of beautiful in its own right. I think it did something more than any of the photographs I was able to take at the project did. It talks about time. It's it photocopied, stamped, and notarized, and in a way, it's probably the best document that I have of it. But yeah, so after that bureaucracy, the way the parts of the ecosystem that would be on this project came together was dynamic and sort of ever changing. People led different aspects of each living system. So this is an example of Carissa Carmen's work. So Carissa led all of the garden systems and the chicken systems. We were able to have 4 chickens on the water pod that would provide eggs for us to eat in the morning. And then other inputs were infrastructural, engineering, welding, building, water and energy systems. This is a water purification system, plans for it that was made by Humboldt State University students through a professor named Lonnie Grafman. And Lonnie used the water pod as his class's client. So maybe this is just a note about how some of the collaborations here worked. The students made projects that worked and were implemented sort of out in the world and could collect relevant statistics for how they worked. And of course, like in exchange, we had clean water. So individual pieces sort of came together when we were able to stack functions like that. Each of the living systems depended on the other, and when they came together, they had to find that cohesion and that overlap. This is the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where at the last minute, there was a gap in their schedule, and they allowed us to bring a borrowed barge that came about also fairly last minute to the site. And we had a month to build it out, and we had collected materials. Somebody named Allison Ward, who's a performance artist, worked for an art handling company, and we were able to collect a lot of their refuse over the course of a few months, and refuse from other places around the city. And we came to the site and built. And then with 4 friends, I was able to live on the sculpture for 6 months. The food and the water and the energy was all cycled on board. And just to talk a little bit about how the structure worked, it's very, first of all, the look and the aesthetics are very improvisational because those materials were, and they were all kind of gleaned at the last minute. There are 4 cabins, and that's where 4 people had bedrooms, including myself. And then on the left, there is a kitchen and a shower. And the main space is a geodesic dome that was a performance space, or a space where we could hold public events. And then around the perimeter are these annual garden beds where we grew almost all the food that we ate. There are the 4 chickens that are in the back that were just for eggs, but they were also nice. And then we collected rainwater from the rooftops. So a 1,500-gallon water tank is near that tugboat, and that is then stored. And when we're ready to use it, it's pumped with solar panels through the water purification system up to a 55-gallon drum on the mast, and then is sent to the kitchen and to the shower through gravity. And then the water that's left over becomes gray water, and that's sent through a gray water cleaning system made of reeds and plants. So we could reuse it on the gardens. This is an unusual view because usually it would be docked at a pier, and the tugging was an entirely different process that just happened when we had to move, when the permit ran out and we had to move to the next place. Another view of the solar and the gray water system, chickens. And then this is part of a video that somebody shot. And I think what made the project compelling to me was that it sort of was able to exist despite all of this bureaucratic resistance. I became really captured by that part of the project, I think. But over the 6 months that we had permission, we witnessed the structure adapt, and it was because people came on board with better ideas about how to build things than what we had initially implemented. And I think that's really what made me fall in love with public art, was that there was a place for almost everybody who came on board to feel like they had something to add to it, like even if nobody asked. And it just became a richer and a space that worked better over time because of that. Not to mention the struggles of living together in a confined space for 6 months with limits to what that space could hold. That was certainly challenging, but I think the other end of it was that these systems just became so rich over time because of all of the people inputting their ideas into it. Trying to think of if I want to say anything else about this project. I think part of the art that I didn't really realize until later was just how different this type of space was for an urban environment. It sort of took what I knew from farming and living in a countryside and transplanted it into a place where it relied on the inputs of such places. Like cities are always relying on inputs from outside. And yeah, I think it asked me to think about not only the systems that the inputs and like the refuse, but also about my life on land and my own habits and my belongings and my complicity in that. So when we disembarked, I remember thinking about the fact that on this barge, there was never any place to put refuse. So if people brought things on, we had to try to find a way to make it work. It was not a system that like we had really thought about the trash part of it. And so I think getting back to land and just realizing how dependent my life there was on having a space to put refuse, essentially, I did start to reconsider the objects that I was living with and my own consumption. And I think maybe the water pot asked me to respond to my own desires for consumption and also respond to the collective monument that we're building called the landfill. So it took me really years to feel brave enough to make this first bundle, but it was in direct relation to living on the water pot and not having a place to put refuse, and really there understanding what essentially I needed to live. And I think this was also about maybe attention that I was paying to the objects and to my movements around these objects with string, like maybe even attention to like this ritual of a certain type of accountability that I was coming to terms with. And I think, yeah, understanding my personal consumption and understanding what it would mean to not part with the objects necessarily that I had in my possession, but how to highlight them and how to take away their use. And I also wanted to maybe probe my shame around them. Maybe what the things said about me or something like that. But when they're wrapped together, they would represent their whole, their individual parts more hidden. And unless people looked closely, they wouldn't necessarily see the individual objects, but you would hopefully notice these personal monuments, monuments to excess and the weight of that, literally, ethically, psychologically. What it means to extract from the earth, to pollute the water, the air, the people in its path before they would come into somebody's possession. So over the course of a year, I bundled almost everything that I had acquired and held on to, except for things that I felt like were essential to art making, for instance. And I pulled the bundles through New York, through different areas to emphasize what they carried. Thinking about the mining and the production and the distribution process. Again, my complicity, the weight of these everyday objects. The act, I think, took a cue from Alan Sekula, particularly in how he traced global systems through specific containers, through ships, through ports and bodies. And I think the bundle sculptures, of course, are more personal. They're an archive in a sense of, I don't know, of extraction. And I think that there are other inspirations for this project that are not coming to mind right now, but Sekula is certainly one of them. And when I could be more detached from the objects, the work took on more of a mapping component, connecting the bundles to particular places around the world, visual and spatial records of consumption, of accumulation, of displacement too. They led me eventually to think about my camera and one of the tools I didn't put into the bundle that I really relied upon every day. The camera, I started to think about it as a set of elements, and this is an attempt to photograph a portrait of the camera by looking at the elements that are involved in making different parts of it. In the process of that, I'm taking you down a rabbit hole now of my own sort of method of inquiry and of research, but I fell into studying cobalt, and I think it was because of an opportunity that I had to go to the University of Michigan and study there as part of a fellowship. And I was able to go to the Eagle Mine, which is in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. This is an image of Eagle Mine in the morning. It's relevant because it's the first mine in the United States that after about 30 years was mining cobalt in decades, even though it's not profitable to mine it in this country. So that the US military is the largest buyer of pure cobalt in the world, I learned, for high-grade weapons, and that 63% of cobalt is currently purchased directly and indirectly through the Congo, deemed it a security risk for the US military, and cobalt was then reclassified as a strategic mineral instead of a conflict mineral. And I think I'm thinking about how this is also part of the camera. That supply chain is also part of what I'm taking on when I'm carrying this camera. Here, then the minerals shipped across the Great Lakes to Sudbury, Canada, where it's smelted into metals. Then it's alloyed, and the alloys are shipped back. And some of them go right next door to Detroit, to old car factories that now contract with DARPA to build drones. So thinking about that, the drone camera as part of what I'm holding. A map that shows essentially where cobalt is being mined, depending on stocks at the moment. And I think, and so maybe this is something that it's very different from the water pod, and it's different from the last project I'll talk about, Swale, because it is very inward looking in a way through looking out. But it's certainly made me re-examine the practice of photography and cobalt's current role in remote cycles and extraction, its prominence in art histories, how it can be shown kind of abstractly or poetically. So this is something I've been working on that I don't really have an answer to, but it's a part of a practice of photography, making still lives, trying to figure out what art means in this context. And then how cobalt circles and cycles back into the studio. And, I think at this point, I feel like I've been involved in so many extractive cycles, but I do want to continually get closer to the non-extractive ones. And the cycles that have really long compelled my imagination are not necessarily the technological ones, but the plant-based ones. So I wanted to just show this one more project called Swale, because I think Swale is and plants in general are cycles that teach abundance through care and time rather than through depletion, of course. And this is an image of Swale from above. Obviously, it emerged out of a necessity and frustration. It asked, why have food and water become distant from collective care, and can art, in a way, try to recenter them? So I had been diagnosed with celiac disease, and I had to change my diet and move toward fresh food. And I was also angry that a community garden in my neighborhood was closed down to make way for a development. And I just felt like that wasn't, all of a sudden, that didn't feel safe. Felt like it could be taken away again at any moment. And I think, meanwhile, access to fresh, healthy food was growing more expensive, and across the city, maybe similarly in San Diego, where it feels like we're really in a food crisis. And the tension between the scarcity and possibilities for abundance, and then between erasure and potential for something maybe more permanent, I think meant to me that public parks had to be the answer. So I think I focused on a structure that could be near a public park to be a provocation for a public park. So New York City has about 100 acres of community garden space, for context, and about 30,000 acres of public parkland. So there is a big difference, and it has been off limits there to forage in public parks for nearly 100 years for a number of different reasons. One is the idea that foraging could harm a fragile ecosystem if too many people participate. And it's really upheld today because of potentials for contaminated soils and polluted waters. So folks who are interested in the idea of foraging in public parks always question, what would it take to be able to safely and collectively harvest from public land? And, how do we address these different issues? So I think because of the experience on the water pod and sort of understanding how the waterways rules worked, I felt like this was just made a lot of sense to try. So I proposed a floating food forest for a Kickstarter campaign and a small grant. And the idea was that it would be able to be framed as a sculpture and built on a barge, and it would be mobile. And because it relied upon the common law of the water, it could be a public space that wasn't governed by the same land-based restrictions. So that legal loophole for Swale was key. It meant that Swale could dock adjacent to public parks and could invite people to harvest fruits and vegetables and herbs without breaking any public land laws. But I think, the point wasn't just the loophole, it was also to ask, who decides what's public, and how can art interrupt property regimes to rehearse other ways of organizing space in the city, life in the city. And to go back to the water pot again, it had been to a place called Concrete Plant Park in the Bronx. And the people who started that park are an organization called Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice. And we'd been able to work with them for the water pod to bring it there. And this is about 6 years later. And I talked with Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, the people who were there at the time, about bringing Swale there after it was built. And they had, like I said, they'd started the park. So some of them began coalition building and policy work as teens, leading community discussions around turning this old concrete plant into a park. So taking the steps to build the park was really their legacy. And they were excited and really got involved in Swale from the beginning, coming up to the place where we were building, had permission to build it out, and started the whole process from the very beginning. As a strategy for staying in place, that was like part of it was rebuilding relationships with community groups through the water pod, and also serving multiple purposes. So it was a sculpture, which served the purpose of sort of getting the permit for the park. It was a food source. Certainly, I mean, that was what it was claiming its intention was. Green space, an educational platform at times for sharing community knowledge with events and workshops, and a public gathering space. So I think about strategy a lot with this project. It mirrors the strategies devised for the water pod when it benefited participants in multiple ways to be involved. That was what Swale was tasked with, I think, is like figuring out how this could benefit different individuals and different groups in order to really be able to implement or hopefully sway policy in New York City. So I'll just say that it's based on food forestry, which is an ecosystem of perennial plants arranged through companion planting that in fact can be strengthened over time. So unlike the annual gardens that we had on the water pod, which we would always have to be replanting, this would require less and less maintenance over time. And I had first learned about food forestry through a resident on the water pod named Casey Tang, who was so upset that we weren't doing it there because he said we would have had so much less work to do had we been employing perennial plants at that time. And he emphasized its roots in traditional ecological knowledge and indigenous land practices. So on Swale, we really did co-design the living system together and embrace the biodiversity and permaculture strategies for creating systems that are plant-based, that are really resilient to pests and disease and environmental changes. And of course, this is moving all the time. So there are so many environmental changes that are influencing the barge all of the time. This is like, I couldn't find a better picture, but we dealt with rainwater scarcity on the water pod, which is an issue I believe probably persists in San Diego as well. On Swale, we relied on river water instead. So we pulled the river water up through a pump and then into a slow sand filter. And we stored it there for times where it was too dry and we needed to continually water. That didn't solve all of our water needs, but it also sort of meant that we had to focus on salt-tolerant plants around the edges. And also, the longer it could be in place, the more it would grow and provide fruits and herbs and vegetables for people. So this is an image from the first year where you can see the low planter beds that are like barely getting established. And then this is a choice image from year 2 where it's really robust. It's becoming really robust. And I think it's important to note that part of this is thinking through how a public space could function as a commons. So a lot of the behind the scenes research went into insights by social scientists like Eleanor Ostrom, who would claim that like in a vibrant commons, people have a really vital role to play, not only as the beneficiaries of the commons, but also as the co-creators of the commons, or as the protectors, or as the decision makers in the commons. So the question became like, if New York City parks could be managed as more of a commons with community stewardship, allowing for different forms of access to a place, what would that look like? And how could it be experienced? And this is something that somebody named Marissa Preffer, who was the main gardener on Swale, a conversation that they were really leading. Some of the plants that people actually wanted to see in their parks. was an ongoing kind of side project of Swale. We didn't know how long it would last, but the first version was built in 2015, and that was with the small grant in the Kickstarter campaign. And at that point, we had enough money to like rent a barge for 6 months. And we thought if at that point there's no more funding to continue renting it, we'll bring the plants back to land and return the barge. But we were able to keep it going through 2019. So we had it running for about 4 years. And maybe I think, the last thing maybe I want to say about what it was like to be on there is it was experiential. You imagine you're walking onto this barge, it's moving back and forth, and you are like you're adjusting to the fact that you're on a moving platform now, and it looks like land, it feels like land, but it's rocking all the time. And depending on where it's docked, you have this view of the city skyline that eventually you stop feeling yourself moving and you adjust to the moving platform, but it really looks like the city buildings are moving back and forth, and the platform that you're on starts to feel stable. And I think that could create a shift in perception that really anchored people in a different story about the city. Like the fact that, okay, it could change. Like my perception just changed. So maybe something else bigger could change too. Here we would talk about where the soil came from, because people always asked about where the water and the soil came from, and really questioned everything before they would take a bite. And I think it just started to open up many more questions about our food systems and where we're getting our food from at the grocery store. It has the same sort of issues that this food off this barge might have, for example. And I think I wanted to show a video from its 3rd year in Concrete Plant Park, and then maybe just end with a couple of reflections.
The South Bronx in New York City is one of the largest food deserts in the nation, with minimal access to fresh, affordable food. A century-old ordinance prevents planting in public parks. So rather than solve the problem by land, a new initiative calling itself a floating food forest is approaching it by water. CBSN climbed aboard.
Your parents give you $5 and you're like, how am I gonna make these $5 stretch? You're like, oh, could I get a salad? And you find out that it's $9 and you're like, I only have $5. We don't see fresh mint, fresh peaches, fresh apples, fresh lavender. You don't see it in the local community, in the supermarkets or in the bodegas. So you tend to shy away from the healthy options. And it's sad.
Swale is a floating food forest. It's using the language that policies are written in to go around those policies and grow food on water instead of on land, because it's illegal to be on land doing this.
I heard the term food desert being thrown around because we don't have access to a lot of green, right? A lot of fruits and vegetables that we're able to incorporate into our everyday life.
There's people from California, there's people from Brooklyn, there's people from Chicago that came here recently, and other places that are able to say, I live in a food desert, or where I live close by, there's no access to fresh food, that it is unique to Black, brown, poor communities.
People are already seeing that it's a larger issue, and all of these things correlate. High blood pressure, obesity, asthma rates.
Most people, when they come on here, first of all, they're very curious and they don't know what to expect when they walk off that gangway. Once they get here, they're just like, wow, this is so beautiful. But they still don't understand that you can pick stuff and eat stuff and take stuff home. And when we say it's free, that's when people are like, oh, okay, this is for me.
It's okay to take it from the plants?
Yes. People cannot believe that there's corn growing on a barge.
We want to stop the disconnect and really transform the community so we have more healthy options.
The communities that need to grow food the most don't have access to private space. We have to start looking at our parks. We have to start looking at spaces that are underutilized, and that we could consider places that we can go to for fresh food.
You won't believe how amazing Swale and how amazing Concrete Plant Park is until you come and see it. And being able to see that fruits and vegetables can grow in the Bronx, it's priceless. Like, you can't put a price tag on this stuff because it brings the community together, it informs the community, and it pushes for a better tomorrow and a better Bronx.
So that was like Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice describing Swale and Concrete Plant Park, and that was in its like third year, and the project was able to help this happen on land, specifically only though in this park. So in Concrete Plant Park, like in 2017, they did break ground for a foodway. That's like a 24-hour access foodway where people can forage. It's on one place in the city. The Parks Department has gotten behind it, but they're saying that if there is the same like community interest and support in another park, that they would do it again. And it's interesting how they frame it, because they don't frame it as a place where you can pick food to eat. They're like, it's a place where you can pick plants. And obviously they're apples and they're like edible plants. So it's obvious, I guess, but it's still like a way to work around opening up space for access in different types of ways. And I think, as I've taken a pause from this, we did have to return the barge at the beginning of the pandemic because we couldn't afford the rent anymore. And we're at the point where there's enough interest to continue the project in another form, potentially also on the water, but on another floating platform. And I'm trying to figure out if the foodway is already in place, like how that could be relevant. Could it help start other ones, or could it be a platform for something else? So I guess as we potentially embark on the second phase of the floating component, I could share a few things about what I've learned from this. I mean, I show a few last images. I think upon reflection that I have learned that like groups and individuals with different needs and missions can work together in finding space to align. And initiating group work means that, to me at least, it seems to mean that everybody needs to feel ownership over at least a part of a whole, or it seems to not work in this context. Maybe more relevant is that I think maintenance in projects is oftentimes more important than the initial impulse. And that is really why I'm questioning, like, what is the purpose of doing something so similar again? But maybe it is a form of maintenance, is what people are telling me. And finally, I think that a project is successful, like when years later, people don't remember you, but the project is still thriving. So I guess I'm coming here today with the commitment to like continue practicing together, and the shared knowledge that the real potential legacy of artwork as part of a commons isn't authorship, but it's continuity. And I think that's been this ongoing struggle for a person like me it takes so long to do one of these things. And I've noticed that upon reflection, it's been so nice to have the space to really think about this from a distance and come back in with a fresh perspective. So I think I've probably shared too much information, but I'll stop sharing my screen now, and I hope that we can have conversation. Hello.
That's amazing. Thank you so much, Mary. I'm buzzing with questions and just little, kind of reactions and responses. And I guess I should also take this opportunity to just for everyone who's joining us via the YouTube stream, please feel free to add some questions or comments or thoughts in the chat on the YouTube interface, and we'll do our best to fold some of those into our conversation. Let's see, I think I wanted to start off just by asking about how do you sort of think through and work through collaboration especially in these projects, which are there, it strikes me that there are so many levels and modes and types of of collaboration, whether that's, the sort of negotiations that happen at the level of the municipal authority versus the kind of like core groups that you might be working with, community groups that you might be working with. And then there's also all of these, non-human or more than human kind of components, right? That are also strike me as like you're entering into a relationship with these, those actors or systems. And part of me is like wondering too, is like, do you sort of structure or think through collaboration maybe in a similar fashion to spheres and bundles and systems of collaboration, or is it something else?
Interesting. I guess maybe. I mean, I hadn't thought about that. That's really interesting. I have thought about like how to be a better partner in these projects a lot. I mean, I think the first time that I really reached out with people to be collaborators besides be subjects and photographs was through the water pod. And I think I thought, well, I'm going to do all this behind the scenes work, and then, hopefully it'll actually come to be. I have no idea what it'll be like if it actually gets to exist, though. And then suddenly we were at that point where it could. And I realized later that everybody who had said yes to the invitation to live on the project had some sort of deep training in collective living, and it just sort of happened. I was like, how did this happen with these people? Like they had been involved in some sort of like a collective living space in their life with their family or extended families or community, and I didn't have that. And I think I thought on this particular project we could all, like, I want to be in a situation where we can all collectively decision make and share in that. And we just realized that we didn't have the time. And I think that there was something that happened where we were butting heads all the time because the boat is moving and you're faced with all of these potential disasters all the time. Like it's literally hitting the pier and you have to figure out how to keep the space clean, and people are coming on, and you have to make a decision about the garden or something really that seems simple, but it's not, because there are all these things happening simultaneously. So I think they realized that we couldn't make collective decisions, and I don't think I was really good at it anyway. And we ended up just having a person who, like Allison was the only person who would like pick the plants from the garden, for instance. Ian was the only person who would program events. And we weren't stepping on each other's toes that way. And we all felt like we had ownership of a certain part of the project. And I feel like that's not ideal. And, it wasn't in my learned training to like that type of working together necessarily, but it did really work well, I have to say, and it feels very businessy to me too. It's like a business strategy, and it certainly worked on Swale to figure out what could engage interest of a particular person or group. And that's why I said, like in Swale, there were all these, like it could function in a number of different ways, and it needed to, because if it was just one thing, then it wouldn't have had relevance to most people. So I think when I talk about these projects on the bureaucratic side, I also am role playing a lot. So sometimes I am the artist, like applying for the permit, and sometimes I'm not. And like maybe I'm trying to play a more ecological role, or I'm trying to play the role of gardener, or I mean, it's just like there are different roles that are embodied in the projects. And I think, yeah, figuring out strategically which ones make sense for which permit is something that I've certainly done. And that doesn't really talk about collaboration, but it certainly talks about like switching roles, I guess. I don't know. But I'm trying to be a better partner, and I am trying to also learn when to like stand back. And that's where I'm at with like the potential of Swale Part 2. It's like I don't know how much I need to be involved necessarily.
it strikes me too that I loved that little sort of moment at the end where you said, you know, you can measure the success, I'm paraphrasing, measure the success of a project by how sort of backgrounded, you know, the artist or designer becomes over time. And as the, you know, something like Swale or, you know, starts to have a life of its own, right? And be it, you know, it's what is so beautiful about that is that it's it strikes me that it's a platform for other sort of collaborative formations to like thrive, right? And things that don't necessarily rely on, you know, that individual or that capacity to kind of switch between different roles too. So people
Yeah.
just take up their own roles and agency within the project.
Yeah, and I think that's a way that I can see art really persisting is when there are multiple projects on different scales, and we are all like working on them simultaneously, and that's really where I think change starts to happen in a social space, is when things are happening, they're multiplying, and it's not necessarily dependent on a certain actor, but it's dependent on a multiplicity. And I think there's something else I wanted to say about this. Maybe it's around funding. And I always wondered, like on the water pod, it seemed like we couldn't get any funding for it, and, you know, tried, but we were also like, we didn't have the experience to have the context to be in a way relevant to funders, I guess. But also the fact that it is a collaborative project and the fact that it's changing, like I think just makes it almost irrelevant to fund as public art. And I think about that for all of those like non-human collaborators that you were talking about. Like in any way when a artwork that's in public is meant to change like that, it's almost like impossible to get funding for it. I mean, that feels really relevant. But a side note too.
I wanted to, first of all, thank you so much for such a inspiring and generative talk. I wanted to kind of ask a bit about the evolution of your work. You were so generous to share drawings and renderings and really kind of bring us step by step through some of these projects. And I found it fascinating when you talked about the vessels in Montana, how the experience for the people that came by shifted from watching the dripping to listening. And I wondered if you had advice for makers for continuing to respond and allow for your projects to evolve past that initial conception and idea, just in general, but also with these huge projects where you're just talking about all of these kind of partnerships that you're operating under. I'm sure that causes things to shift and move as they go along. So kind of what advice do you have for makers to kind of let things kind of play out with these creative projects?
Yeah, I thanks for that question. I think it's sometimes like it's difficult to let go of that much control, and I really thrive in that chance. And I think it's because I have this, like I have an idea and I do want to steer it back to that idea, and that the tension there is what makes it really engaging for me. It's a struggle, and it didn't work necessarily on the water pod, where I think I the whole time I was on there struggled with the aesthetics of it, because I thought this is so disengaging for so many people, and I really want it to be as engaging as it can, so it convinces people to think about these ways of living differently. And yet I learned so much, especially in retrospect, in having to live on it and contend with that every day, and like contend with people's experiences every day. And that's not ideal. And that's like, I don't think I'm suggesting that as a way to move forward with projects. But I think that maybe there's somewhere in between. Like there's somewhere where like you're allowing a sculpture or an artwork to be somewhat in public. So people do contend with it. And then you're actually really there seeing how it happens and reacting in real time. I mean, I think that is an interesting experiment and one that's really valuable.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate that response. I'm going to turn it over to Joe for a question from the chat.
I see there's one from So Rivera. Please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing. do you think that there can be a continuous conversation between the people and water in your installations?
Ooh, thank you so for that question. I Yeah, I think there's an artist named Betsy Damon who I've talked with Joe about yesterday, but I think that Betsy would say water is already talking with us, and we have to like be able to somehow hear it, and water's responding to all of the movements around water. And so in a way, I guess maybe the question is how do how does how do we in like the human context, or me particularly, like how can I hear that? I don't know. It might just depend on attention. And I think that potentially something that I could see, and this is very speculative, is like somehow blocking out other senses so you can focus on that intention to have attention, to to aim attention toward water, and sort of watch and listen and smell. And maybe it's about depriving everything else for a minute so you can really be in the space with water. But that's a really generative question. I don't think I have the best answer for it right now, but now I'm going to think about it.
I wanted to jump in with a question to have you expand on one of the concepts you brought up. So when you were talking about memory, you referenced the concept of official memories. And I was wondering if you could firstly just expand on that, but then secondly, talk about how that relates to personal memory, personal experience, because you have so much public engagement with your projects.
Yeah, I think when I was thinking about official memories, I was thinking about like how there's a story that's told specifically maybe about that park, but about every park, like how it came to be, like the Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice Park, like it's their park, or Socrates, is it, it started in all these different ways. It was the history goes back much further than the story that's told, of course. And um so I think about the official memory as now like what is put out there from the officials of the site, whether it's like the parks department or the friends of the park, or the organization who's determining. And that personal experience, I think, really just had to do with just the flooding. And I think that even now with that particular park in Queens, that where that first large scale water clock was, they are wanting to introduce that to the official memory, which is really, I think, great. And allowed people, like what was remarkable to me was the more that I was there and would talk about water with people, more people would talk about their experience. And I kind of wanted to ask everybody today, it was like a big question for me is, when was the last time you were in a flood or in flood adjacent space, or what's the body of water that's dearest to you? And I think people all had stories about that flood from 2012. So it's quite a bunch of time has gone by.
I see a question from Nico King in the chat. I think you all met yesterday too. So, and I'll just read from Nico's questions. It's two-part. The first is, how were you able to keep the community engaged during winter, and did seasons affect the choice of plants for continuity? And the second part of the question is, what actually was needed to change and make foraging legal, quote unquote, I guess, on the barge? Was it because the barge was actually considered a private space, or are there different laws once you step on board?
So for the winter part, honestly, actually, there was very low engagement in the colder months. So we would pretty much close it after the first winter. We felt like there wasn't enough interest in going on board in the winter time, so we didn't continue to try to like fund it for that time, and fund somebody to be there as the docent. And the plants basically would just die off and hibernate and then come back in the spring. So we didn't, yeah, our winter programming was non-existent for that project. It was mainly spring through fall. And okay, the other part of your question, what was the second?
The second part is about the what actually needed to change to make foraging legal on the barge, and was it because the barge was considered a private space, or are there different regulations or laws on board?
Yeah, so basically so that was really interesting because I think it was only the fact that the water laws were different than the laws on land. So because the barge would only dock at public piers, it was a public vessel essentially. Like it wouldn't be allowed to dock there if it wasn't, because it would be taking up public space. So that was a rule that was worked well for the project essentially. But yeah, it was because there are these different jurisdictions that oversee the water, and they just have different laws than the ones who oversee the land, the public land. So I think that's also why it was like pretty place-based and relevant there in a way that I think depending on the laws of a different place, it wouldn't be as relevant, because sometimes, you know, it's not even an issue to forage in public.
And I guess I have a little bit of a follow-up along that, and this is has a little to do with my own personal sort of like research interest too. There's the sort of working, I love how the sort of exploitation of those, you know, loopholes or blind spots, like in the sort of municipal sort of regulatory system, particularly around, you know, growing food and making sure that communities can have, you know, sustainable food systems. And then I think about seasteading, right? And you know, the sort of there's a libertarian and sort of anarcho-capitalist version of that, right? Which is sort of like, oh, we can exploit this idea of mare liberum, or the free seas, as, you know, as a way to get outside of state regulatory systems, right? And, you know, and this gets into conversations around, you know, in case of, you know, ocean environments around deep sea mining and so on and so forth, right? So I just wonder, is there a way that you sort of like hold or think about those contradictions, or do those sort of like, is that something that, you know, you're trying to negotiate, you know, as you're formulating a project like Swale? And
yeah, I mean, I think about it in terms of like, I guess, yeah, seasteading, or even like offshore gambling, or you know, there are so many terrible things that happen at sea because there aren't laws, or there's the common law of the deep sea, or the mare liberum, as you said, and that is really difficult to survey, or to, you know, figure out what is happening there. And I think about like Rebecca Gompert's project, Women on Waves, and the abortion boat, where you can you know, outside of the jurisdiction of a country, where it's illegal, you can have an abortion at sea. I mean, I think that like there are all sorts of ways that this space has been utilized, and some are in my mind positive, and then some are in my mind are really terrible, right? And I think that so it is like a flipping of a similar script. I don't think that it's useful to everything. And I don't know that, like, I think that this happens less where it sort of works the other way. It happens more where it's like the offshore gambling thing, or like somebody can make a business out of doing something that's illegal in a state, or, you know, by going offshore, or, you know, now, of course, we're seeing like fishing, sweatshops on boats, you know, all sorts of things, and that are incredibly terrible. And I don't think that like this has much to do with that. But it's certainly it's in the same waters.
I wanted to ask you a bit about the role of scale in your work. So with your spheres, you talked about the microsphere and the macrosphere, and you've kind of spoken about how sometimes some found objects make it into this space. So maybe some of those things are kind of a standard size, like something from the agricultural industry or something like that. But I guess both conceptually and physically, kind of how do you deal with scale in these projects, especially as, these projects potentially take on much broader audiences and bigger physical space? Like, how do you kind of negotiate this concept of scale in your practice?
I mean, I think that it's always been something that I've been conscious of because photography has a certain scale and it's mass production and mass distribution. And it's like a part of storytelling then. And I think that for me, this like a sculpture is part of a photographic story and the way that it can be shared. So oftentimes like the sculpture to me has to be large enough to be like representative and then sometimes to be useful or to be like participatory, which I think is a different scale and oftentimes. But I think beyond that, what's really more important to me is that the scale isn't about one thing. It's about like the multitude of different collectives of happenings and ways that I think together people can like change the makeup of social spaces because the ideas might be similar about how to make change, whatever that means, but it's happening in multiple places and the same time. So I think about scale in that way too. Like it's not just about one thing, but it's about the many.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really relate to that, having a photo background as well, and kind of thinking about similar to what you brought up in your talk, these kind of more expansively thinking about the extractive industry behind the medium and then how you kind of play into scale on so many levels with your projects. I really appreciate your response. Joe, do we think we have time for one more question or?
Yeah, I'm not seeing any in the chat right now. If anyone has a remaining question, please feel free to add it. I did have one sort of further looser thought. You talked about water as a radical teacher, as a nonlinear timekeeper, as somewhat of an adversary in terms of like apartment flooding, and all these other ways of that water asks us to think about it as a medium, as a life force. And I really appreciated how you grounded this talk in your in earlier experiences of water and filtering water and trying to think about how do we utilize water as a resource, or how is it accessed. And I guess throughout these, maybe the more recent projects, since Swale and so on and so forth, like I wonder how has your relationship to water been changed by like working with it, so closely, intimately, specifically, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's messy. It's it's difficult to work with as a medium in artwork because it never wants to stay, and it's always taking on what it's near. Algae's always growing in it, but I don't know. Maybe it's like a collective lover too, where it's like we know how much we need and depend on water, but it's being privatized all the time. And I think about like the access in so many different ways too. Like we're at the same time, many people are losing access other people, it's coming in through the floors. It's just like it's accessible in all the wrong ways sometimes. It's like a lover.
It's an unruly collaborator, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting when places agree to work with sculpture that includes water, and I think it's really difficult for indoor spaces to do it. But more and more, I think people are willing to take the chance, and like making sure that it sort of comes off in a way where they don't say they never want to do it again is important. That's something I think about a lot.
Do we have maybe a couple more minutes? Like, may I ask a question? So this is fascinating. Thank you so much, Mary. It's really so good to see the multiple layers behind the work and how it also unfolds. See them as time-based pieces, actually, and biological sculptures. So they're fascinating to me. And also, like as an architect, I see your work very architectural, right? It's transforming space, it's enhancing human experience. It's doing all the things that we're taught in architecture school, like create a healthy environment, offer somewhat shelter, etc. But in all these experimental spaces. But then you kept bringing up like public art. You are interfacing with these public institutions. There are a lot of challenges, it seems. You seem like you're dealing with these kind of licensing paperwork, etc., just like an architect would do, because like to build something, it's always difficult with that. But my question is like, as an artist, what are your reflections on public art in United States in general? Because I mean, I've had commissions in like, for instance, Europe or Anatolia, and United States public art as kind of a, I would say art landscape. It seems a little kind of, to me at least, stuck in earlier paradigms of what art should be. And you seem like you've successfully, demolished that belief and convinced people. So what are your thoughts? And do you see that this kind of landscape changing in the future because of all the pressures of A, maintaining public art, B, lack of shortages of water, energy, those kind of things? What do you think as an expert?
I mean, I think that there is a lot of different types of public art in the country, and some gets supported more than others, certainly. And I think that's what I was thinking about when talking about like those, like the stable steel sculptures that oftentimes get supported or funded because they don't change, and because they're like in a way, the idea is that they might be easier to maintain or something like that. On the other hand, like if you're working on a collective artwork, it's very difficult to fund because you don't have like that star who's the Olafur Eliasson who's building the waterfalls, and that's like using water, but it's one person, and I think that is also something that we might be very behind on here. I think that counter monuments is really like that's really different in the last few years, and that is changing what public art can be, I think, in the country. And so there is certainly room for changes that are happening right now. That is good. Yeah, I don't know, like what else? Public art. I think that like my favorite part about it is that you engage with so many people, and like I said in the water pod part of the talk, like people have many better ideas about how to make things sustain, right? And being in a space where also people are coming to a public artwork oftentimes with like very little background in art, and to find some like a form that brings people together, not, it's sort of by chance, right? Is I love that. And I think that like I probably would be my life was changed by that project, certainly, because I was able to just see an engagement from people I never thought would be like engaged in that kind of work. Yeah, it gives me a lot of hope, vitality. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that brings us to our time together.
You.
Thank you so much, Mary, for joining us. Thanks to all who joined us on the YouTube stream and asked such helpful questions. And yeah, I don't know. Do you have any closing notes or anything, Pinar? Or
No, not really. This was just so wonderful and inspiring. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Nice to see you. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.